thinking about social change, not theories of social change, depending on which version of the program you are using. The most recent change was, and the reason why I changed that from what was sort of imposed on me by Maury and Philip is because it more reflects what I want to say. So national economies in a growing number of countries, and by extension, social and political peace, are profoundly dependent on private consumption and on growth. Therefore, those of us who see reduced consumption as a necessary element of ecologically sustainable future are essentially asking for a major social change, a different economy, change in key institutions, a culture and social practices in which consumerism would play a significantly diminished role, the production sector that would focus more on delivering services and public goods rather than consumer goods, and application of technological innovations in the service of less rather than more consumption. Well, that's a very big challenge. So the way I see it is that short of some major societal ruptures, this process will most likely be, at least initially, incremental. And that's contested proposition. That means that a variety of small-scale initiatives in the policy, business, and nonprofit and civil society realm will be taking place. And I propose that if such initiatives are to become real agent of change, they all have to have some common directionality, so that the social and technical learning thus produced will converge in a consistent and hopefully powerful way. That necessitates that the proponents of such initiatives must intentionally and thoughtfully keep in mind the broader context in which their projects operate. So here I would like to highlight 4 elements of this broader context. It's by no means exhaustive list, but something to think about. So one of them is we need to think about macroeconomics. In the current economy, national wealth, as measured by GDP, is largely created through private consumption. In the US, that number is around 70%. In Germany, as I came up with some numbers, is around 60%. Actually, it's an interesting question, what produces this difference? But it's high. The price we pay for it is twofold. One is that, of course, ecologically unsustainable demand for energy and materials, and 2 is the lack of attention to the equity dimensions of this economic activity vis-a-vis the actual social needs and well-being. In politics, it matters less how the GDP is created and who benefits from it, and more that it is generated at all. So bringing it back to thinking about initiatives and experiments, as we consider specific policies and campaigns toward reducing consumption, we need to ask ourselves this: does it contribute to the necessary shift toward an economy less dependent on consumption? Does it contribute to the necessary shift toward an economy that reflects the current social needs and at the same time is more dependent on public investment and social spending than the current economy? And plenty to spend on healthcare, childcare, education, less industrialized food production, renewable technologies, and so on. So essentially, ask ourselves, are we through this initiative shifting from the economy so heavily dependent on private consumption to the one that's more dependent on public spending, social investment? The second frame, we need to account for the power of ideology, which of course is connected to the first point as well. The neoliberal ideology delegated to the market the job of improving the well-being of people. In Karl Polanyi's words, it facilitated the disembedding the economy from society. The price for it, the price we pay for it, includes growing inequalities in income, wealth, access to services, and opportunities. Now, I take a case in point. Case in point is current interest in livable smart cities. Walkable, dense, rich in amenities, with public transportation, discouraging sprawl, economically thriving, and attractive to the so-called creative classes. That's the language in which it's being discussed. In principle, this is ecologically and economically desirable. But leaving the development of these cities entirely to the market creates huge inequalities. The very people who kept these cities going during the years of neglect, certainly in the US, are being priced out of them. We need to support these low and moderate income people, city inhabitants, not only because it's fair and just, that's pretty much obvious, but because it is they, owing to their income, who have low ecological footprint. And here I am drawing on a very well-established relationship between income and ecological footprint. You tell me, at least in the US, because I am familiar with those graphs, tell me your income and I'll tell you what your carbon footprint is. And regardless of whether you care about climate change or not. So the solution is not, of course, to abandon the idea of livable cities, but to balance the market forces with investments in public amenities and alternative forms of housing ownership, such as cooperatives and others. So an example I like to give is this development in Manhattan called Penn South. My parents used to live there until their death. This is a high-rise community of approximately 8,000 people with low and moderate incomes in the midst of great wealth and high housing prices in the Chelsea section of Manhattan. It was developed during the John Kennedy's presidency by a labor union for its members. The labor union is all gone, long gone with the garment industry being long gone from New York. But Penn South thrives. Why does it thrive? For several reasons. It has a continuing ideological commitment to social good. It gets tax subsidies from the city. The fiscal model of limited equity non-profit cooperative allows them to have monthly payments 1/3 of what's in the surrounding community. Huge difference. And they have a very thriving, democratic, participatory governing structure. It's truly a sustainable community in every respect, ecologically, socially, economically, much to say about that in terms of diversity, ethnic, racial, and so on. And serving people who would otherwise be pushed out of the city. Activating these kinds of projects requires challenging neoliberal ideology. If that can be done, communities like that are entirely within the realm of possibilities. And you would create these enclaves of low carbon footprint, sustainable communities in the cities that are not for us anymore. 3, we need to look at post-consumerism through a cultural lens. Cultural anthropologist Cindy Eisenhower, one of the contributors to our book that has a flyer outside this room, has taught me that culture evolves together with underlying economic structures and institutions in a particular historical and geographic context. It's not just a bunch of values that we share. It is part of the underlying societal structures. And here is my example. All my examples are from the US because this is what I know best. But it would be fantastic if during this meeting, these examples were enriched from other parts of the world. So take, for example, the cultural change that accompanied the rapid shift in the US in the years following the Second World War from cities to suburbs. It was a big inversion. Cities got emptied, suburbs grew at enormous rate. This shift took place in no more than 1 generation. It was incredibly fast and had profound impacts on household consumption of goods and services and the ecological footprint of an American family. More to the point, it created a host new set of social practices, values, and beliefs. The understandings of what good life is in a free, democratic, and prosperous society. What drove this cultural change? Well, largely, it was the need to find new civilian markets for the enormously productive wartime industrial complex, and to find employment for the returning war veterans, in combination with the availability of cheap land and the particularly American emphasis on autonomy and individualism. So there was a cooperative effort going on there. The government provided interest-free loans, built infrastructure, provided free educations to returning veterans to enable them to enter middle-class life. Labor unions pushed for higher wages. They could have pushed for longer vacations, which was so short of in the US, but they didn't. Their focus was on higher wages and basically purchasing capacity. And of course, the private sector produced the goods and deployed its genius of marketing to change our view of what good life is, grounded in consumerism and anchored in the sprawling and ecologically impactful suburbs and exurbs emerged later. And of course, the big infrastructure emerged, and the whole industry of housing, construction, and home decoration, and institutions, the mortgage markets, the investment banking, and more recently, all this casino capitalism that they had on Wall Street. This all evolved around this shift from cities to the suburbs. And this example, and of course, they are huge barriers to change. These are strong institutions. So this example shows that it is fruitless to call for change in values, as we often hear. Rather, we need to think about cultural change in tandem with transformation in these fundamental societal structures. The 4th point. When innovations in information technology recently gave rise to the so-called sharing economy, for a brief period, there was an intense interest in these new economic forms as potential change agents in the society. The optimists hope for a change in a culture of consumption and social relations from emphasis on individualism and private consumption to more solidaristic and communal forms. The hope was also for less material consumption. Even I wrote about it in a published paper, which that section of my paper is out of date. The hope was also for less material consumption, but as Juliet Shores and others, like in her group and others elsewhere, their research has shown the power of free market ideology and incumbent institution is such that these new business models have quickly become reoriented into platform capitalism rather than a sharing economy, even among the proponents of social change. But the more socially oriented variants have not completely disappeared. We have cooperatively owned car sharing services that function outside Uber, Lyft, and these kind of companies. We have 2 libraries, maker spaces, are established niche activities, and bike sharing, of course, programs have been fabulously successful worldwide. The point here is that new technologies can be channeled into the service for social change. But this needs to be a deliberate effort, directional effort. It requires a simultaneous harnessing of market forces and public policies and resources. Essentially, it requires a recognition of the potential of emerging technological innovations to facilitate social objectives. And socio-technical transition framework, that some of you are familiar with it, is a useful way to conceptualize this. I won't go into it, of course, there is no time for that. But I would like to invite you to think about the potential of self-driving cars to make suburban garages obsolete in the US, huge amount of land. To upend the insurance industry, car insurance industry, who is responsible for an accident when there is no driver, right? To facilitate the retrofitting suburbia and to change the culture of cars and sprawl. Here is a nascent technological innovation that we need to think about. What can it do for more sustainable consumption? So going back to small-scale initiatives that I started with, the world is abuzz with small-scale innovations in all kinds of areas and provisioning system, food, housing, mobility, leisure. These are very inspiring initiatives. Some even lead to lower ecological impacts and less consumption. But to a sober observer, it is clear that these initiatives by themselves do not have the power to affect major social change. We talked about it last night over dinner with Derek. The question is often asked, how to scale up or replicate this experiment? But I think that it would be more appropriate to ask a different question. Here are the questions. How to take advantage of the larger scale social, political, and technological processes and changes to enable those initiatives, to grow and challenge the incumbent system. It's not the same as replicate or scale up. Another way of framing this question would be how to create the conditions under which the social and technical learning that emerges from these small-scale experiments can alter the mainstream. So I argued in the beginning of this presentation that small-scale initiatives need to be given a direction by designing them in the context of these 4 frames that I propose. But that is not enough. We also need to recognize and take advantage of windows of opportunity. And here I draw on the work of prominent sociologist Eric Olin Wright, who argues in favor of nurturing novel modes of social organization in the fractures of the dominant system, metaphorically. While not threatening the incumbent system, institutions and power relations, these initiatives, these niches may provide the groundwork for future more radical social transformations by providing the vision, social and technical learning, and building social capital. Emily Haddard Kennedy, another contributor to our book, flyer is out there, provides an interesting example of what I have in mind in writing about Eat Local movement in Canada. This movement has traditionally been determinantly non-political. But its leadership is increasingly recognizing that it creates great inequities, the $4 tomato, and is limited in its growth capacity. To overcome these impediments, the Eat Local movement must confront the powerful incumbent system of food production, including the design of government subsidies that go to the incumbent and not to the challenger, and the economics of food production and distribution and retail. And what's interesting in her findings in research is that these leaders are beginning to be ready to reframe Eat Local movement as a political agent and given an opportunity to link with other challenges of dominant food system, such as public health, social justice, and environmental communities. So in short, what I am talking about here is two things: deliberately harmonized and consistent framing of small-scale initiatives as potential change agents given a window of opportunity. Two things: harmonized directionality, consistency among these different initiatives, and finding windows of opportunity. What could provide such windows of opportunity? Well, I don't know, but I can think of some, right? Potential. For example, it could be a big social movement against growing unemployment and underemployment and the need to turn to caring and educational sector for economic opportunities. That may be an opportunity for shifting the economy somewhat away from private consumption as the generator of economic activity and more towards delivering public goods and public investments. That would, in the words of Karl Polanyi, again, would be the second movement that he writes about, which emerges, in his view, in response to the excesses of the first movement. In his writings, he refers to market fundamentalism, the free market as the only organizing principle of social life. Or it could come from a challenge to the industrial food production system from the public sector, fighting against obesity and diabetes, or from an acute public health disaster, such as another mad cow disease outbreak, which will not be as quickly contained this time. Or from environmental advocates concerned about pesticides and other externalities of the current food system. What I'm saying is here are these other areas that may open windows of opportunity. Or they may come from the protests from the millennials who are interested in urban life but are priced out of the gentrifying cities. Or it could come from the economic interests who want to invest in the dying suburbs and cities like Detroit and see economic opportunities in rebuilding them in a different way, retrofitting these suburbs. Here are opportunities for creating housing and community arrangements that foster sustainable lifestyles. Or it could come from technological innovations, as I mentioned, such as self-driving cars, which may actually challenge the land use policies and address frustrations that people feel over choking traffic. So in my final observation, I would like to highlight the fact that the opportunities that I present here for the small-scale initiatives that can use them to grow and challenge the mainstream, notice that these are primarily social policies. They're not viewed by most people as having anything to do with ecology or sustainable lifestyles or reducing consumption. What that means is that the sustainable consumption research and action activists must form alliances with these social change advocates in other domains. The New Economy Coalition, I'm throwing out names that I'm familiar with, Solidarity Economy, Public Health Community, Smart Cities Community, and so on. This is where our windows of opportunities are going to be.
Thank you, Halina.